Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm very pleased to be joined this week by Nader Ihmoud, who is the editor-in-chief of Palestine in America, and also based in Chicago, just like myself. So welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And so Palestine in America, I was introduced to this. I was very fortunate to be introduced to you because of Chip Gibbons at Defending Rights and Dissent, who put together a fabulous event. And then Iad, who is the owner of the Nabala Cafe, graciously offered the space up in uptown Chicago to have us gather and discuss freedom of the press. For about an hour and a half, we sat there and we had a really nice, cozy gathering, if you could call it that, when we're talking about such horrific things that are going on in our world. But no, it was really a pleasant evening to be there with everyone. And you work on well, go ahead and grab it so people can see. You work on this magazine, Palestine in America. Let's take a step back before we get into that specifically. What led you to get into journalism? Why did you want to be a part of this work?
I mean, it started in high school for me, actually, when I realized I wasn't going to be a professional athlete that I wanted to be. Uh, but I still wanted to be around sports. I love sports. I love to write. And I remember taking a journalism course at like junior year of high school and falling in love with it. Just I got to cover a high school football game. The energy was great. Interviewing the athletes afterwards and getting them to talk about the coach in a way that, you know, might not be too pleasing to hear for the coach was like exhilarating, having the whole school talk about an article you wrote. You painted a picture for so many people that weren't able to make it out to that game that night. That was really, fun for me. And I could see myself doing that as a career. So I decided, to apply to journalism schools. I got into Mizzou and Columbia College, downtown Chicago. I wanted to stay close to my dad and my family and my mom. So I just stayed in the city and I very good professors. All of them pretty much worked in the industry. So that was pretty cool. But yeah, that's how I pretty much got my start into journalism.
And I should say that we actually have commonality because I graduated from Columbia. And I believe you came through in the 4 years after. I graduated in 2010. But you weren't far behind me. And I'd say some of the issues surrounding the work that I ended up doing while I was on campus had shifted somewhat, but it was the era of Barack Obama, and there were a lot of global war on terrorism issues that were still dominating. And there was a lot of, I think, it was admirable, anybody who was trying to do the work, but there were a lot of people who were saying, like, hey, why don't we not move on from what happened with President George W. Bush? Why don't we look at the way this government used torture to pursue its wars? Why don't we look at some of these human rights abuses? And so that was a big part of, while I was on campus, what I was focused on doing. Now, you were at the Columbia Chronicle, and you had an experience while you were there that became a catalyst for starting Palestine in America. Can you describe when the administrators of the school, and by the way, for people who don't understand, the school is different from many college campuses or universities in that the campus is the city. The is like that was always sold to us. Like, we don't really have a campus. The campus is just going out into the loop, as they call it in Chicago, and being around the movie theaters, the theaters for off Broadway shows that are coming through. There are a few other colleges that use buildings downtown. There's the lakefront. There's a lot of like gentrified parts of the loop that become your campus. And Columbia was actually a gentrifier of its own, but that's for another discussion. In any case, you were at the newspaper and you had an experience that led you to believe that you should take the step to start Palestine in America.
Yeah, I mean, it started in like phases. I don't know if you remember about the Chronicle, but we used to have what's called a top five, and they were very playful. You would do like, top five foods I like to eat, things like of that nature. And so I had been a part of the Chronicle since my sophomore year when I took a class that allowed us to write for the paper uh, without actually being paid by the paper. And so, like, I had written by my junior year, like, 4 top fives. So I decided to take one a little bit more seriously, and I did a top 5 reasons why the US should stop all military aid to Israel. And a student on campus took exception to my top 5, and, most of my top 5, delved into, like, war crimes and women and children being murdered, that sort of thing. And so I got an email from a student and he CC'd like everybody, but I didn't notice at the time. And he emailed everybody and including me and was, criticizing my top 5. And I responded in kind saying, you're defending the murder of women and children. I really hope I don't see you on campus, pretty much. And that was like my first run in with the head of like the newspaper and whatnot. They reprimanded me for responding. We had a rule where you're not allowed to respond to emails. If you wanted to respond, you do it in the paper. And I kind of just like let my emotions get the best of me and responded anyway. And so they reprimanded me, but they didn't fire me. They kept me on the paper. It was kind of just like a hush hush thing, just like keep your head down so that we don't have to fire you. And then, I eventually earned my own sports column. And then the next year, you know, I was, low on ideas of what to write in my column. And I read this article about how these soccer players, uh, they're like young 17, 16-year-old, 18-year-old maybe, and they're coming home from like their club practice. And the Israeli soldiers that were in the occupied West Bank uh, attacked them and then sucked their military dogs on them. And doctors said that they might never play soccer again. So I wrote a column demanding FIFA take action against this sort of thing, and reprimand Israel and maybe even remove them from FIFA. And that is when things hit the fan. I remember being in a class because we were going to publication on a weird Thursday night instead of a Friday night. And so I was in a late class when the general manager came up to me while I was in class listening to instruction from a professor and whispered in my ear that they were going to hold off on my weekly column and put an ad in its place until we could sort this whole thing out. Because the administrator who helped us with our paper, a Pulitzer Prize winner by Jeffrey Lyon, decided that because he couldn't find verification from like a Harrods article that what I was reporting on had not happened, even though I had reached out to 2 international reporters, and verified what had happened. And so the next week, after they put an advertisement in my spot, I came into my desk and I found a printed article from Harrods dated 2 weeks prior, basically them reporting on the same incident that I had. And now this week they were going to allow me to publish. But during the whole process, it was scrutinized. Jeffrey Lyon that week was in Boston for some conference, and he made it mandatory that every time my article went through edits, he would get faxed a copy. And now I will give credit to our editor in chief at the time. Her name was Heather Shoring, and she has written for Palestine in America, and she's a good friend of mine. She really stuck up for me at the time, and she stuck up for me in the original time with the top 5. She has always had my back, and I will say for people like that in newsrooms, that's huge, because if you're writing about something that some deem controversial because they have an objectivity issue, not you, they do. It's good to have somebody who has a good journalistic background to have your back, and she did in all those instances. And I remember at one point her telling me, "Go home. I got your back. I'll deal with these edits. I don't want you dealing with this anymore." And my article, to her credit, was printed as well as she could get it done. There was some concessions made, like I had to put at the bottom of the article that I was a Palestinian American. So that in itself was, I was like, I don't want any Palestinian to ever have to go through that again if I have anything to say about it. So I started the magazine to give Palestinians like myself an opportunity to get bylines without having to go through that headache.
And just because it is an important issue for all people who are trying to work on this, before we get to your particular publication, I mean, what was that like for you to be hit so hard with the fact that like your identity was not necessarily an asset, but sort of like, but I mean, it's almost like it was a demerit kind of. It was almost like it, not a disqualifier entirely, but it was like, well, here, let me think of it this way. It's like you had to disclose it in order for people to hear your opinion. But it's like,
But now
if
that I
I do
think
this
about it, Kevin, now that I think about it, it was always to discredit me. Like the first way
yeah.
you phrased it was perfect because now that I'm older and been in the game for a longer, at the time I didn't realize it, but it was his way of telling the reader, take this with a grain of salt. He's Palestinian. He's not objective. He can't be objective. He's Palestinian. He's gonna sway towards the side of the Palestinians. That 100%, that was what he was trying to do, and I didn't realize it at the time. The thing that I did realize at the time was what I had like assumed from the beginning was that I knew that I would take it harder when something like this happened to me than, let's say, an article about Northwestern that I wrote got pulled. You know,
Mhm.
I cried. I was in the classroom in front of my peers crying because I felt like my identity was being crucified. I felt, and then I got this like terrible news and I couldn't control my emotions. And to give a little bit more insight to like how like chaotic this night was, my teacher was like, "Do you need to step out for a minute?" And I did. And on my way to step out, who do I run into? Jeffrey freaking Lyon. And he like smirks at me like he knows what he just did to me. And he goes, "Hey, how you doing, Nader?" And I literally tell him, "You know how I'm effing doing." And I kept walking, like you're a journalist, or you say you're a journalist, and I'm a journalist. We all know, well, now we know how this feels to have something done. Like that was crazy to me, to have something that I had two sources verify. I did everything that you're supposed to do. The rigorous editorial process when it
Yeah.
comes to, publishing things like this of this nature. And we did all of that, but because it was about Palestinians, it got the hook. And the crazy thing was, I know for a fact if he tried harder, he would have found that Harrod's article before all that happened. Maybe he had even seen it already and he was hoping I would never see it. I don't know. But it was from that moment on, I was like, I guess sports have to take a back seat in my life. And I felt selfish writing about anything else.
Yeah, so you caught me a little tongue tied, but what I was trying to get to was like sometimes I'll be referred to as an activist journalist, and I'll resist that label because I know it's pejorative. And while I think you could be proud to be involved in activism and do journalism at the same time, I know that those people who try to attach that label are trying to take what I'm doing down a peg. And it's like, well, no, I've done everything that you're supposed to do as a journalist. I've researched the facts. I have an opinion about it, but it is informed by all of the resources and materials that I've collected. And, this gets into why it's so valuable to have a Palestine in America publication where you're bringing in Palestinian voices, where you're bringing in those perspectives, because it's like those sets of facts, those realities they just get brushed aside for other realities, right? Like it's a what Palestine in America is about to me is the chance to challenge a narrative that is dominant. And it's not necessarily to say, although I think there would be a lot of valid reasons to say that it should be discredited, but it's not to say that everyone's point of view, coming just from an American point of view or coming from an Israeli perspective, is completely vile and vulgar, although it can be. But it is to say, we don't get to have this conversation. We don't get to cover what's going on in these wars with Palestinian voices. They just are not there in our media spaces.
They're not, and that's pretty much the main reason why I started this. And it's interesting because even when like uh, Coates was being interviewed on CBS, and he's telling them, he's like, the Palestinian narrative isn't all over our TV screens, which is why he approached it the way that he did. And I really resonated with that, because that's pretty much the approach I take with Palestine in America. It's going to be few and far between where you'll see us ever source an Israeli official. Because why? You know, that's all over the news. You want to hear their side of things, just turn on CBS, Fox, ABC, whatever. And also I take the stand that, if I was covering, civil rights, I wouldn't need a quote from a KKK member. So that's the way that I look at it as well.
Yeah. And so tell us about, okay, so you do this journalism issue. There are other thematic issues I want to get into this work and how you're expanding people's consciousness about Palestinians and just, the humanizing, right? I mean, the fact that like these are not just terrorists, these are not just people who are fighting in oppressed conditions. These are people who are artists and sports athletes and others just like you and me, which I think it's important to destigmatize them. I want to get to that, but can you tell us about your friend and colleague Mohammed Mahawish, who you profiled and whose story really resonated with me?
Yeah, Muhammad, I was introduced to actually a few years ago, while he was studying in Gaza as a writer, and he wanted to write. And so I think we published one of his pieces, and we stayed in touch. And I witnessed him, from afar after writing, one article for PIA. I'm not saying that we're the reason why, but just seeing his elevation from that to start to writing for The Guardian and other big publications was amazing. And so I really was like, happy to follow his career, especially like as someone, I love when someone who's just getting started writes for us and then they explode and they have so much success. And then to have him even at times reach back out and say, "Hey, how can I help the magazine?" Like that's the whole, like the cycle that I want from the magazine. And so that was amazing. But things obviously turned for the worst last October, when Israel accelerated their genocide against the Palestinians, and he immediately just started covering the war. And I actually, while I was in working on this edition, because of my relationship with him, I didn't want to reach out to him immediately and do a story about him, because I know how journalists feel. They don't want to be the story, especially, your friend or somebody that you know. But eventually, I felt his story needed to be told, because this guy, despite being injured and needing to take care of his pregnant wife and his child and his sister and his mother and his father, was still reporting, was still doing amazing work, like reading his articles and saying, dude, in a war, how are you still able to report and write so eloquently? So he is, and he's young too. I think he's only 24 years old. This guy has impressed me since day one. Okay. And, maybe it has something to do with his mentor being Rifat, God rest his soul. But this guy is one of the best writers and reporters I've seen. And if he was in the US, the major publications, and if he wasn't Palestinian, the major publications would be fighting over getting him and the sources that he's able to get because of the relationships he's able to build because he's a genuine person and a genuine reporter. So all that comes through. So he's amazing, and people should definitely read about it, read about him more in our article that we've published. It's online now at PalestineInAmerica.com, and they can support by buying the magazine or downloading the digital version for $1. But reading his story is very powerful, and I hope that we could continue to work with him and he can publish more articles with us instead of us writing about him.
And I think everybody should support this publication. I've put up on the screen image shows the cover, and you allow people to pre-order editions. And as I said, you're doing a lot of thematic issues to cover different areas of the Palestinian experience and the contributions to the world. And so as I listen to you speak about Muhammad, and one second here, let's see. So and then this gives people a glimpse of some of the different ones. So we see the sports and the film, and you have a food issue that you've done. Uh, but as I listen to you speak about all of this, I need to bring into our conversation something alarming that has taken place in the past week. And for those who get to this conversation when I post it in the next few days, it'll be a few days later from October 23rd. But we saw, and this has become routine, of the Israeli military posting what is basically, in my mind, no different than putting up uh, this is no different than putting up wanted posters of those that you think are criminals and basically giving a license to hunt down those individuals. And in this case, we're talking about 6 Al Jazeera journalists that the Israeli military has circulated. These are people who are devoted, like Mohammed, who you just spoke about. The other 6, those named there, just so you know them and you can make a point to follow their work. And I'm going to take this down here because I don't need them to be up there like that. Is Anas Al Sharif, Talal Aruki, Allah Salama, Hossam Shabbat, Ismail Farid, and Ashraf Siraj, who are all Al Jazeera reporters. Their network has strongly refuted this idea that they basically fabricated these documents and splashed them around and said that they're Hamas terrorists that had infiltrated Al Jazeera. They're working as propagandists for Hamas. And I'm sorry to sort of disrupt the flow of our conversation with you for this, but I want to give Hassam's perspective space here and then have you respond to what he's saying. Israel's army has released fabricated dossiers framing us, the last remaining journalists in North Gaza, reporting on Israel's extermination and ethnic cleansing campaign as terrorists. This blatant and belligerent attempt to transform us, the last witnesses in the North, into killable targets is an assassination threat, an obvious attempt to preemptively justify our murder. We would like to remind everyone that after murdering our colleague Ismail al-Ghul, Israel released a document that claimed he supposedly received a military ranking on July 1st, 2007, when he would have been a 10-year-old child. And then in this part here, it says the public threat was made without any evidence and is part of a systematic propaganda campaign to justify the unjustifiable as Israel continues to target civilians in Gaza, including doctors, aid workers, children, and us journalists. We call on our colleagues and media institutions around the world to show their solidarity with us. Despite these dangerous and untrue threats made against us, we remain committed to our profession and will continue to report the facts on the ground as the genocide regretfully continues unabated. So I'll bring you back. Your response to what we see is happening. And I'm not suggesting this is the first time that Israel's done this, but just that this is a glaring example that merits a pushback and resistance.
Yeah, I mean, they like you just mentioned, they've done this before throughout their history, and most recently in the last year, with almost each of the hundred of journalists that they've killed, over 100 journalists that they've killed. They when they get called out on it, their response is to deflect and throw propaganda and hope that it gets forgotten about. Just like with the days of the week on the calendar and at Al Shifa Hospital, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. They are always going to use this tactic. I will say though that for Palestine in America, we are, even though we don't have that much of reach, we are drafting a letter condemning these actions, and we are going, since we're Chicago based, we're going to try to get Chicago, uh, other Chicago media outlets to sign on with us, probably in vain, but we are going to try and we are going to do. So hopefully by the time this episode is out, that letter will be out condemning these actions. It's just absolutely like the crazy thing is, like we discussed Monday a few days ago, there's citizen journalists there as well. And what about them? So the six that Al Jazeera, at least they're getting coverage, and there might be maybe a chance to protect them. I don't, with the way things have been going, I'm very fearful for them. But because of their proximity to a big organization, there's a chance for them to be saved and protected. I fear for the other journalists out there that no one knows about. Even like for me, for our website, because we publish things on our website that don't make it into our magazine. I'm commissioning a writer in Gaza who's not too far from there, from Deir el-Bala, to write about what's going on in Jabalia, and I'm in contact with him constantly, and other writers from Gaza that are writing for our food edition. And so they have friends and families that are stuck in that area, and they might whip out their camera and record what's happening. And the minute you start to record, you become a journalist. And I had this argument with, not an argument, but conversation with a friend of mine who isn't a working journalist at the moment, but has done journalism and sees herself doing journalism in the future. You're a journalist. Just because you put your hat down for 5 minutes doesn't make you any less of a journalist. You're just not in the field working at that moment. So I fear for those people who don't have a huge syndicate to uplift their voices, because there's a lot of those people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if you take a step back here and you recognize that there aren't only journalists that are under attack, that all of the human population, and I'll just spend particular attention on North Gaza right now, because that's where they're saying these journalists have been doing their reporting. That's where they've been following the siege and the terrorism that has unfolded for the last 3 to 4 weeks, aggressively, the extermination campaign that we've been observing. And I think one thing that can happen, I'll just speak from my experience, and then maybe you can help me unpack this further, is there's a tendency to forget that these journalists are actually living among these people, that they are suffering just as much, as they're going through this trauma just as much as the people that they are profiling. So while they are bringing us these stories, they're turning a camera on their families, friends, colleagues, people in these areas, while they're also, as you write about in your issue, having to strategize for their own survival, how they can move around and avoid the bombs. And now in this case, you know, not to, we don't have to stay on these six journalists that have been singled out, but just to connect what I'm saying, it's like now your name has been splashed around. You become even a bigger target than you were previously. Now that has to be part of your strategy as you move forward in your journalism as well.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine you're a journalist, and the best way to become a higher paid journalist, to have, a steady job, is for more people to read your work. But if you become more well read, if people read your work more, then you become more on the radar of this extremely psychotic regime. This Since 1948, they've had this mentality, and now it's like no holds bar. And so that's even scarier for them to be brave enough. Like for Muhammad Mhawish to be brave enough to tell his story, to write about it, to then be interviewed about it for my magazine. Ahmed Wahidi, who I also feature in the magazine, to be willing to talk about his experience at Al Shifa. That's bravery that a lot of people would not have. And so they're putting themselves at risk, their families at risk, but a lot of them feel like it's a duty. So when Palestinians, and I don't know if anybody's ever, mentioned this, but there's 1,000 ways for us to resist. There is those that do by journalism. There's those that pick up arms. There's those that, decide to live, a happy life, to teach the children. All those are resistance, because Israel just wants Palestinians to just give up, roll over, and leave. And we have what's called samud, steadfastness, and it comes in all different forms, whether you're doing it, you're resistant violently or non-violently. And I heard this specifically from I'm on the Palestinian national baseball team, and the guy who founded the Baseball and Softball Federation told me this is our way of resistance: playing baseball, raising our flag on the international level. So don't ever feel like you're not doing enough, because you're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing if you're raising the Palestinian flag in a respectable manner.
And I just to pick up on what you're saying there about there's many ways to resist. The case can be made that in these other issues that we're talking that I want to get into now, of bringing in the food, the culture of Palestinians, showing people the way Palestinians are involved in sports, film, music, that's resistance too, because the idea out there is that we would erase these people and not let others know that they are there. And so um, I'll, I'll move towards my area of interest at the end, because it's also lighter and I think will provide people a momentary break from the doom, because there's a beauty in art, there's a beauty in these people that are going forward and trying to give us something in which we can indulge our have entertainment. But you wanted to be a sports columnist, and so let me just take an opportunity to recognize that there has been a major issue in the world of sports when it comes to Israel. And it connects back to what you said earlier with FIFA, because they were given an opportunity, it was handed to them to ban Israel. And a decade later, they made their decision, but it was also put forward in an even more stark context. It was to say that you've banned Russia because of the fact that they're inflicting a war of aggression. They're behind a war of aggression against Ukrainians, and so none of those athletes that are Russians can compete under their flag. And shouldn't that be the thing that you do with the Israeli athletes? And your opinion on all of this, just the lack of accountability, because I'm I have mixed emotions about when we punish athletes from their countries for something that their governments are doing, because I don't know if they really have the influence or power to stop that. I don't know if they should be held responsible. But that's what we do to Russians. That's what we do to Chinese people. We do it to Iranians. We do it to a lot of different nationalities except Israelis.
The crazy thing is, I'm not going to act like I'm an expert on the Ukrainian-Russian war or anything, but in my opinion, if there was a country to single out and do that too and punish their athletes, it would be Israel, because of the fact that just look at the polls of how their entire population thinks of the Palestinian people, the fact that they all serve in the IDF, which to me is a terrorist organization. So unless, these athletes can say, hey, I never served, I was brought here by my parents forcefully. So that's too much. Like, you're getting too much in the mud. Israel
That's a
should
good
not
point.
be competing on an international level under that banner. Now, if those good Samaritans, wanted to, become good Samaritans and become, Palestinian and live rightfully next to their Palestinian brothers and sisters, because there's plenty of Jewish Palestinians who lived peacefully in Palestine prior to the occupation. So if that were the case, yeah, then you play under the Palestinian banner because you're a Palestinian Jew, and that's all good. That's cool. But Israel, like any other state or nation, doesn't have the right to exist, and the way that they exist is detrimental to every Palestinian. And how dare they get the right to compete at FIFA or the World Baseball Classic? And then even that, when their World Baseball Classic, when their baseball team is good, they just go looking around for, the best MLB Jewish players and add them to their roster, and they had never stepped foot in Israel, or technically Palestine. So, um, yeah, if there's one, it's funny that the one country that doesn't get singled out should be the one that gets singled out, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because every person in Israel is going to be conscripted into the occupying forces. There's a draft in Russia, but I mean, to some degree, it could be said that at least a third, I would imagine, are probably doing it against their will. They don't really have a choice. You could look back to our own United States history with Vietnam and people being drafted, and realizing like there really wasn't much. My life's gonna be destroyed if I just don't go along with going into it. But in any case, to stay on topic, you do a music issue, and I'm just sort of curious, because I've in another life, when I had a media organization that I was running with colleague, he we I regularly focused on like protest music every week, and it was almost like, to be Palestinian is like all music is in a way protest music. I don't know if it's fair. I wasn't denigrating it. I wasn't trying to put it into a bucket, but some people don't want to be put in these categories. And I think about that, and how I imagine in your magazine. I haven't had a chance to read any of your music issues, but I imagine that is like a struggle. Like, I want to go out and be part of this industry. I don't want to always just be defined by my occupiers.
Yeah, and you'll find, if you get a chance, the music edition that we most recently put out back in 2020 during the pandemic is probably one of my favorite editions we've ever did. It was guest edited by Sam'an Ashrawi. He's a really good music writer, and he told a lot of amazing stories that will basically show you that, yeah, not all Palestinian music is resistance music. Uh, there's a lot of artists that just went out and, they lived their life, they loved music, and they just did it. Even in our first edition, we highlighted a group from Chicago called Drama. Their producer is Nader Ihmoud. He's Palestinian American, and he like he does identity, come out and say he's Palestinian and supports all these things, but his musical identity isn't Palestine. Like their music is really good. It's like house, dance, love music, R&B kind of mix. So there is a lot of artists that you'll see that we featured in both our music editions that don't subscribe to, protest music, but there are guys like, there is a rapper in the Chicagoland area named Wahib Nassan. He's been doing that before it became popular, within like the last year, before like the Macklemore stuff started happening. Now it's like it's in to make those Palestinian songs, where a lot of these guys were making these songs before they were popular, and maybe they got like, you know, 10,000 hits or something like that. But now it's become like the cool thing to do. You see Macklemore dropping two different songs, and even Anis, who he featured on the the second version we featured in our first music edition. And I remember interviewing him before he exploded and became super popular, before Justin Bieber co-signed him. So like it's a lot of different things. The one disappointment in the music industry is DJ Khaled, and that's pretty much everybody else gets, as long as you don't stay silent on the genocide, do whatever you want with your music, but don't do it in silence.
Yeah, don't give space to it. Don't reinforce it in your work. And I recognize the constraints. So just to, because my passion is film. Just to end here, I did want to ask you. Speaking of erasure, I'll end on this, and this sort of takes us far afield from what we were talking about in terms of freedom of the press and all of that, but it does matter to me. And there's this push right now to challenge Netflix, because I don't know if you've seen this, but they just took like 19 Palestinian films. I don't know if any of them they're television, but they took down and they just removed them. They're just like, you're not going to be able to watch them. And I don't even know if we know if it's because they didn't continue to license them. They had previously been a space, though, that hosted these stories. And now there's a push to challenge this. You've talked to filmmakers. What's your view about the loss of the access to this work?
I think I can't speak to why they did it specifically this time, but in interviewing filmmakers for the film edition, there is, like you say, Zionist in every field, but in the film industry, it is plentiful. And then people who work around the Zionists turn a blind eye to them because they're usually people who are in power. So I could definitely see this being because it's Palestinian and they got pressure from somewhere, somebody in the higher ups to remove them. And I could see why they wouldn't give details on why they did it, to leave it murky. And I think by them not giving details and not being completely forthright and saying, hey, we just didn't renew the licensing agreement or whatever the case may be, that I think it's fair to assume the latter happened, especially with, I could tell you from my own experience, when a Zionist gets a whiff of something and they want to dox you or they have an intent to get you down, they are not going to let up. So I can imagine that for the last year that that Zionists have been uh, going at Netflix and people who have high power and high situations, and you can trust me, we don't there's negotiations that we have no idea that happen where you want my movie, you got to take these movies down and look at the metrics. Which movie is going to get you more dollars? All that stuff. I can totally see it happening. We're always going to be devalued by these things. And that's why, like, not to just toot my own horn, but it's important to create these things like even like Watermelon Pictures. Like, I think that's huge. That's a big deal. That's going to force the issues. Like, if they make a good Palestinian movie and it's successful, now you're going to have the Netflix guys going, why didn't we get that? Why did this
Yeah.
small time, even with me, if I break a story about Palestinians one day that news outlets revere and they're like, oh man, why didn't we get that? That's a huge deal. And that's what we need to do to, I mean, I don't really base, how I feel about myself on how they tell me they feel about me. But at the end of the day, everybody wants validation. And if validation leads to more eyes on your project, that's a good thing. But yeah, I'm not surprised by their decision, but I can totally see if there's enough pressure, these movies going back up, because we've seen people just tiptoe back and forth on these issues. Because honestly, what we've seen for the last 76 years is people don't have backbones and either eventually they grow one or they just continue just to have a soft spine. So it's honestly up in the air. And the film industry and the music industry, it's sad because we love it so much. We love entertainment, but when you start to dive in and peel back the layers, you start to see, the dirty truth behind both industries. And hopefully in the coming days, more independent work can start. Like, that's what I like about our industry and journalism is a lot of independent journalists have said, you know what, I don't like the New York Times writing for them anymore. I'm going to start my own Substack. I'm going to bring my readers to me. I don't have to be stuck in this one mold. So I hope the same happens for the music and film industries, so that way they don't have to be tied to Zionist sellouts.
All right, and you've given me 50 minutes of your time, but I have one concluding question that I think is important to uh, basically speak to your background and also tie this all together. On university and college campuses right now, we see quite a struggle for student journalists. And I think there were a few of them that came to our event at the Nabala Cafe. And I think about what they're looking at and how difficult it is for anyone who is trying to get their start. And I don't think it is unreasonable to say that I think it's harder than it was in the 2000s when I got my start as and I was an independent journalist, but because there's whiteness going on, and I'll call that out just while I'm talking here, just to be fair. Just to be fair. But uh but I also just think that the fracturing, the atomization, the fact that there's like 25 or 30 different platforms that it's really, really hard to reach people in one space, although it's not entirely impossible. The thing I wanted to get you to speak on, and then give me any final thoughts you want for the show, and I'll let you plug your stuff again so that people can go support it, is what about these student journalists that are trying to do this on their campus, that want to cover the protests, the demonstrations? What stands out into my mind is the way in which we've seen these administrators, like the administrators that got in your way, who are frustrating their ability to cover police coming in and raiding encampments, and frustrating their ability to go, and then also doing these things where it's like, hey, you got to be really careful about whether you go and participate in these rallies or demonstrations for Palestinian lives. And I don't know, like I feel important. I feel it's important to be unbiased. I think you should try to cover all your bases, but I don't really know if issues of human rights are ones that you should be banning journalists from, like, participating in these campaigns.
Yeah, it's a very difficult thing to balance because like I mentioned earlier, or maybe when we talked on Monday, the first thing that was tried to be drilled into my brain was objectivity. And it was like, if you're Palestinian, how can you be objective about what's happening to Palestinians? And I think that objectivity needs to fall under, like you said, two equal people having a dispute. That's where objectivity comes into play. Now, when you have an obvious power dynamic like you have with the Palestinians and the Israelis, objectivity needs to go towards the Palestinians. It needs to go towards the person that's being persecuted, the person with less power. That's why, like, for instance, when you're covering, a situation like a crime, you might, say what the police are saying in your story because they're a direct source of what happened. But a good journalist is going to have some skepticism. They're going to do follow-up sourcing. They're not just going to take the police at their word. And for some reason, when it comes to Palestinians, we're actually doing the opposite. When we were talking about objectivity, that gets thrown out the window, and it's like, Israel said something, boom, headline. A Palestinian said something, well, let's give credit to Hamas run hospital. Like, who cares who's running the hospital? It's a doctor that told you that this many people died. Okay. Who cares if they're a Republican or a Democrat? That's how I look at it. Whenever they're like, I just be like, tomorrow on our news cycles, when we have a tornado in Kentucky, it's going to be, and we're getting news from the hospital about how many people that they've confirmed have died from the tornado. If that hospital happens to be in a red county, are we going to call it a Republican run hospital told us 10 people died, that would be stupid. So that's how I look at it when reporting is done on the Palestinian issue. And so when I see student journalists being, hindered from doing their work, it's all about the thing that we talked about on Monday, where it's the trickle down effect of just trying to cause fear. Because as a student journalist, if this is happening to you, you're thinking to yourself, I'm trying to have a career. I'm not Palestinian. I might be this white kid that goes to Northwestern. I could put this in the back of my head, go to sleep at night, and not care about it because I don't know anybody directly affected or dying, and I'm just gonna go do a different job. I'm gonna report a different story, a different important story, because there's so much going on in this world that is wrong that I could totally see a journalist being like, you know what, I'm gonna go cover Sudan. No one gets mad when I cover Sudan, or I mean, I'm sure people do get mad, but that's the point I'm trying to make. Like the civil rights movement in the U.S. that used to be like a no brainer, slam dunk. Uh, abortion rights. That used to be a slam dunk. It's no longer a slam dunk in this country. But things like that, I could see them going to cover those things because to them, they're not going to get the pushback. They're not going to get doxxed. They're not going to lose their job. When you're at Northwestern, and I forget the professor at Northwestern, God bless him, but when you see your professor who is trying to protect you get reprimanded for protecting you from doing journalistic activities, that is going to, unless you're Palestinian and you are not, and you're staunch and you are the bravest of the brave, you're probably going to take a step back and say, hey, I really want to be a journalist. I don't want to cost my journalism career. Like I could see them devalue, and that's again, you devalue Palestinian lives by doing that, because now you're making someone pick between their livelihood and a Palestinian's livelihood instead of just, hey, this person should get their livelihood and they should be able to cover what's going on in Palestinians and be able to tell their story and hopefully help them get the news that they need, so that that could put pressure on governments to make actions. But all this stuff is being hindered by the fear tactics. I mean, just look at, even, God bless the student journalists at Columbia. We had a writer, Jude Taha, who wrote for us about the encampment at Columbia, and they were so brave against the kettling that the policing were doing against them. They were amongst their students. They're seeing their fellow students getting kettled by police, and they're there reporting and being told that their press passes don't matter. So it's sad. For a fact that had those students been covering anything else, they wouldn't be treated in the same way. I remember when we were in college, I think it was like the 1% protests were going on and stuff like that. And yeah, they were treated like, like the media tried to paint the 1% protesters as like bums and, losers who had no lives or whatever the case may be, but they weren't demonized like this. Anytime something with Palestine has to do with, you get demonized so quickly. And so for any student journalist that sticks by their will and continues to have samud, like we say in Arabic, they continue to have the steadfastness despite all the attacks that they receive. They have the highest honors. They are the best journalists. Those are real journalists. Everybody else who steps away from this issue, unfortunately, you are a propagandist. Because if you're a journalist and you cannot speak this truth to this power, what's the point of you picking up the pen? Just go take a job in advertisement. If you want to, all you want to do is tell beautiful, pretty picture stories, go take a job at an advertisement agency. They can use you. I've seen a lot of bad written copy there. I'm sure you're a great writer. Go do that. Go make a lot of money. But don't come into our space and act like a journalist and just regurgitate lie after lie after lie and not challenge that lie. You got to be sick in the head to do that and then call yourself a journalist, Jake Tapper.
All right, so let me do this up just really quickly here. If people go to PalestineInAmerica.com, that's where they can support the issue. And also, um, if they didn't want to buy magazines, because sometimes people are weird like that, but they wanted to donate. I'm just being serious. I do my publication, the Dissenter newsletter. There are people who I've said you could get a copy of this, just subscribe to it monthly. And I had somebody who was really insistent and was like, well, I just want to give you money monthly. I don't really want your newsletter. Well, okay. I don't understand why you wouldn't want something in return for money, but Here you go. I gave them a link. I made a specific link just for them to support my work monthly. Because I guess I had not accurately or appropriately accounted for all the people. So anyways, is there a place where people can just
Yes.
donate if they don't want the magazine?
Yeah, I mean, there's a donate section on our website that they could donate to. There's several ways they could support us. Like you said, they could become monthly subscribers for $5 a month. I know that you mentioned that we're a monthly issue, but we try to be quarterly, but we're more
Oh,
like biannually. But really, if you're a subscriber and you're paying $5 a month, you really just want to support the magazine, and you're just happy when you get a magazine. But when you subscribe, you do get access to all of our digital copies, and we send you all of our print copies that we've printed in the past. So that's cool, and then you get all of our future print and digital editions as well. Or if you don't want to do all that and you want to buy individual copies, we sell our individual copies online, print and digital. All of our digital copies are only $1 a piece. So very low investment to get some very good journalistic work written by me and other great journalists, a lot of Palestinian journalists, but we have people that are not Palestinian as well. We are currently working on a deluxe food edition. It's gonna be amazing. We have an amazing guest editor, Nyla. She's from the Chicagoland area, and she's a great food writer. And basically, this issue is going to be more like international focus, where we are bringing in a lot of writers from Gaza and from Palestine to write about the food situation that's going on in Gaza. Like one article that we commissioned, a guy is writing about the difference between how maklouba, a very famous Palestinian dish, was eaten in Gaza before October 7th and how it is prepared now after October 7th. And the support is huge. It helps us pay our writers. We are a self-funded magazine, so all of our rates are really not that great, to be honest. But especially for this deluxe edition, we're doing some fundraising, trying to hit some goals so that we could pay our writers some bonuses. So we do offer low stipends, but in the future, if we can raise enough funds and get enough supporters, we could start paying our writers a more respectable wage and become, maybe even a better publication, and attract even greater writers and reporters. But right now, we're self-funded. Sometimes that means me and my wife coming out of pocket to pay writers and pay people, but we don't mind doing that. But hopefully in the future, we have enough money to pay people a livable wage. We want to get people full-time jobs. We're not there yet. I'm the editor-in-chief, but I haven't seen $1 from the magazine since its inception. I don't want to see $1. I want to pay writers a livable wage. I want them to be able to be proud of this magazine, proud of this publication. And that's my main focus and main goal with this, with my journalism career. Is if it happens to lead to a full paid job, that's cool. But if it's just a self-sustained magazine and all my writers get paid and they're happy with the amount they get paid and they're happy with the work that they're completing, that's, the ultimate goal right there.
amazing. I really admire what you're doing, and I thank you for coming on the show this week. And I'm so grateful that I was connected, because I just didn't know that you were out there doing this kind of a thing, and it's really important, and I'll do whatever I can to try and give it a boost. Yeah, why don't we give it here? Everyone, you got double vision. It's in both frames. This is Palestine in America.
I will
Thanks
say
for,
the drawings for this edition, I just want to say, were drawn by Layla Abdelrazik. She's a Palestinian Lebanese American. She's currently based in Michigan. She's an amazing artist. Look up her former work. She drew a graphic novel called Bawadi. It's amazing. She even it's a full circle moment, just for a little tidbit behind the inside baseball for your viewers, is Layla Abdelrazik drew and designed our first ever edition with Rasmiya on the cover. And now she came back and drew these images. And the person who lays out our magazine is Shireen Creates. She's an amazing Palestinian graphic artist and designer. So just want to give a shout out to everybody who's ever helped with the magazine. I'm really grateful for everybody. And I'm grateful, Kevin, for you having me on and showing us some love. So thanks again.